Thank you everybody for coming today and joining us here at the Pride Centre, this amazing facility. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people, traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, land that has never been ceded. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So, wonderful first that we can meet together. This is exciting. Having a function like this is heartwarming to me, and having people from overseas is even more heartwarming. We've been through some extraordinary times lately. Why are we here today? We're here today because we have a guest, Rabbi Mike Moskowitz from New York, who's come to talk with us. I'm with Aleph Melbourne and I'm Michael Barnett. Some of you will know me, many of you will know me, and some of you may not. Aleph Melbourne is a social support and advocacy group for LGBTIQ plus people in Melbourne's Jewish community. As you can see on the wall behind, we represent all colours and flavours of the rainbow. Anyone and everyone are welcome to join with us in celebrating inclusion and diversity. And we're also here today with the wonderful support of the Australian GLBTIQ Multicultural Council. We have Alexander and Judy here representing the AGMC today. And it's with their help that we're actually able to have this room and meet in this wonderful Pride Centre in the heart of Melbourne's queer community. Perhaps I might just have Alexander come and say a few words to us.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Good morning, everyone. So, AGMC, this is where we are today. Our office is just across that side. And what AGMC does is we work alongside the local government and also federal government on helping them or challenging them on policy for multicultural, multi-faith community. And when I say multicultural, multi-faith, we also include our refugee members and also our First Nation as well. So what we try to do is to make the right things to our community and also contribute what we can back to the community in many ways. At the moment, we're working on intersectionality, try to help multicultural, multi-faith people to reduce discrimination against society and also bullying as well. So that's what we're doing today. And if you want a copy of the research, we actually it's on our website, agmc.com.au. So hope you guys can enjoy some reading. And besides, we also do a lot of research on a lot of things. AGMC also have a subgroup called AGMC Academia. So we are supporting a lot of academia scholars who are trying to complete their research for their uni or PhD in that space as well. So all the research, all the information we receive will be shared with the AGMC back to the community. So that's the whole actual AGMC. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. That's lovely. Okay, thank you. So now that we've had some introductions, what I would like to do, help frame the context of today's discussion, is play the Aleph Melbourne documentary video. It's very short, it's just under 10 minutes. It gives a bit of context for where the queer community in Melbourne has come over the last, or in the Jewish context. It's come over the last 20 plus years. I have done some research actually. When the Jewish News, Australian Jewish News newspapers put their first 150 years of print publications online through the National Library of Australia Trove Archives, it opened up access to newspapers through the 1970s and 80s, where there was a whole lot of discussion around, I guess it was the pre-AIDS era in the 1970s, and what Jewish communities, the queer Jewish community in Sydney, were trying to come together and form some sort of social presence. And there was a lot of discussion in the Jewish News about a gay group forming in Sydney, and they call chutzpah. And so I did the research and pulled all those newspaper clippings out and put them online. And so there's been a presence in Australia, at least since the 1970s, of queer discussion. in the Jewish community. But we started in '95, and so I'm going to start our little video of where we came from and the struggles and the celebrations that we've had here, and then we'll turn over to Rabbi Mike. So we have Rabbi Mike Moskowitz here today, fresh from New York, as I say, direct from New York.
Indirect from New York, we live in San Francisco.
Oh, well. And so I'd like to welcome you. Thank you very much for making the time with us today out of your hectic schedule. I know that you've got a lot going on. You're, as I understand, quite the activist, or outspoken in some areas, I guess. You're with Congregation Beit Simchat Torah in New York City. I was there in 2007. I was in town for work. I visited your shul. I happened to walk into the New York City Pride March one day. It's sort of a funny thing. All of a sudden there's like 10 million people there for a Pride March, and I didn't know it was on. I happened to go to the service at your shul, and it was quite a wonderful experience. I don't know that I went there for anything that was Pride, but it was a Shabbat service, and I enjoyed feeling welcome at CBST. So I think that that's a wonderful place for people who are Jewish and queer in New York to go and do what they want to do and feel included. You've been there now for how long?
Started my 5th year recently.
5th year, that's great, excellent. And so could you tell us, please, a little about what you do at CBST and what drives you?
Absolutely. So first, thank you so much for the invitation to be here, for making all the arrangements, and it's a very powerful video that we just watched. One of the big truths that we operate with is that it does get better. To be able to see it in one's own lifetime is really, really inspirational, so thank you for all of your work. I'm Rabbi Mike Moskowitz, my pronouns are he, him. I am the scholar in residence for trans and queer Jewish studies at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, which is a little bit awkward because I'm not trans and I'm not queer. But allyship is a little bit awkward, right? Because it's predicated on the world being broken, people being dehumanized. And it's as elusive as it is aspirational. What can be very supportive and affirming for one can be actually traumatic and offensive for another. And so it's really important to be in a relationship and have that proximity, and to recognize that the world's really broken and it's on us to fix it. So for me personally, like many who get involved, it has a personal narrative. I was educated in the Ultra-Orthodox world. I accumulated 3 Ultra-Orthodox ordinations. I studied in the Mir in Yerushalayim and Beth Medrash Govoha, B&G, in Lakewood, New Jersey, which is the largest yeshiva outside of the Mir. And I was a rabbi at Columbia University and the rabbi of the Old Broadway synagogue in Harlem when someone in my family transitioned. I had no space to process. I wasn't able to gain any sort of traction. I said, what do you mean? Like, I just don't understand. Like, what do you mean? Like, I just don't understand. I had never thought about my own gender identity outside of when I was a kid and told which bathroom to use. And because there were some really lovely people, both in the gender studies department at Columbia and also wonderful people at Keshet, which is an organization in America, in a couple of weeks I got to what I think is a relatively generative space of just knowing that I don't know. Like, I've published now close to 200 articles, and I don't have any greater understanding, right? And I think that's what it means to be cis. Gender is actually, there's a limited awareness of gender, one's body. And so I work in allyship and advocacy because you don't actually need to know what it's like to be somebody else to advocate and to make sure that the world is a safe and inviting and welcoming space for them. And so my work is very broad around trans issues, and interfaith and interdenominational spaces. And then within the Orthodox world, which is really kind of the edge now in America around LGBT inclusivity, in that the other movements for the most part have visibility and representation and inclusivity, there is LGBT plus issues. And even in the last 5 years, the edge has shifted from counseling parents of queer Orthodox youth when they come out to now counseling the parents when those kids have met other kids and now are getting married to each other. And so it's happening very quickly. It's the best of times. It's not until 2 cities in Orthodox spaces. But in America, unfortunately, there has been some very significant backsliding around LGBT rights, particularly around the intersection of reproductive rights and healthcare, and marriage equality is being threatened. So the work is, for me, theologically motivated by my understanding that if I want to have a relationship with God as a parent, then I need to take care of all of God's children as my siblings. And when we look around, like, this is just not how you treat family. And so for me, it's personal on those levels. And I'm so grateful for the language that and for the understanding that I've been given from the queer community that has informed my understanding of the divine. I see the divine revelation now as like God's coming out speech, right? And unfortunately, like, we forced God back into the closet because it's actually not a safe space for God to be out. And I think that's why even, the sin of the golden calf, just 40 days after God said, "This is who I am," and we kind of erased God's identity by saying, well, no, like, I understand that you told us that you're the infinite source of the universe, but we have this golden calf and we're gonna, pray to it, and your identity, we're not willing to validate or affirm. And so I think, like, there's a lot that everybody can learn from the lived experiences of others, and it's not unique to the human experience, but it actually kind of has its source in the divine. So that's what I think motivates me the most, is not just as a person who cares about other people, but even in this meta space of how am I going to answer to the divine for my actions and my inactions, of creating a space where, like, a sanctuary can be literally a safe space for people to be the most authentic and genuine versions of themselves.
Wow. So that there's a lot in there. I mean, your journey's been fascinating, and what you're advocating for is very powerful. There's people in this room I know who are allies too, who aren't queer. I mean, there are people here who have what one might call a rainbow family, or they've got children who are gender diverse or trans. Some of us are gay or bisexual or lesbian. There's everyone here. Many of us, I suspect most of us in this room, Jewish or come from Jewish background. In your what's fascinating to me is that you have this ultra-Orthodox background. You're overtly Jewish or overtly Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, and yet there are many who I would say perhaps on your side of religion don't see it the same as you. Why is it that you're there and they're not there? What is this disparity or incongruence?
So I would like to frame it that, like, they're not there yet, because
Yes.
I am optimistic. So people often ask about, how do you change halacha, and it's not yours to mess with. And
Jewish law.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's a function of changing Jewish law. I think it's about applying it properly. I come from a community when I was younger in yeshiva. Most of my rabbis smoked, right, cigarettes,
Right.
and then they got the memo that it's actually not healthy to smoke anymore, and so then people stopped learning how to smoke. The halacha didn't change, right? But it used to be not just acceptable but encouraged. It's healthy, and then it became prohibited, right? There's responses of prisons forbidden to begin smoking because of the health. So the halacha didn't change as much as the access to information. So I would say, like in Hebrew, and I'll translate, you can't paskin a shaila until you know the mitzias. You can't answer a question in Jewish law until you understand the reality. And because really the world wasn't a safe space, the modern LGBT movement from Stonewall is just 50 years old, right? It's a new question, right? Because people weren't able to be out, whether in a secular space or in a religious space. So I think that because I have somebody in my family, I have multiple people in my family who are LGBT+, I think I kind of got a front row seat to a reality that they haven't yet ever observed. And so when I was going through the question of someone in my family who was transitioning, and I was speaking to my rebbe, my rabbis, one who's like a very big expert in Israel on education said to me, the truth is I have no idea, I've never been asked this question before. And I said, Rebbe, like, if you don't know, then who does, right? Like, you're supposed to have a monopoly on the truth. He said, I had no idea, I've never. So asking people to weigh in on things that they've never been exposed to, right, like, doesn't give them a great chance of getting it right? So I think, like, that's kind of the edge. And so when rabbis have started to get questions, and it's not just one person calling saying, hey, this is what's going on, it's now like hundreds, right? You can try to attribute it to whatever you want, but the reality is that, like, it's not going anywhere and it's real. So again, just to give a different historical context, and this is one of the edges that's shifting, historically when a boy would come to his Rebbe and say, it's not that I'm not attracted to this woman, it's just that I'm not attracted to women. So they would say something like, well, you've never been with a woman before, right? Or, we all have tests, you have to take one from for the team. You'll see she'll cook for you, she'll clean, it'll be fantastic, right? All sorts of the intersection of all the best things. Right? And then when there really wasn't a place in the world to be out, people suffered in silence, right? Because there just wasn't the ability to say actually, and there weren't communities and structures yet. And so now that the ability does exist, and the deleterious effects of that rabbinic malpractice have been well documented, that when asking someone to marry someone who they're not attracted to never ends well for anybody, there's now been this shift to say, actually, okay, if you're not attracted to her, don't marry her, don't ruin her life. You will figure out what to do with it later, but and then there's a space to have a conversation of well, it's not good to be alone. The Torah says it's not good to be alone. So what then is the divine will? And even hearing the offensive rabbi in the background of not having families, the reality on the ground is just not true anymore. We have a very robust Hebrew school for children from queer families, and what that means to be able to have children today is very different because of technology and society. And so as the reality of our world becomes uncovered, we then need to discover the divine will. To say one more thing about it theologically, as some version of a religious fundamentalist, I believe that God gave the Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai. It is immutable, it's eternal, it's infinite. A consequence of that theology is that God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai about LGBT plus issues. Where should a genderqueer person sit? Right? How do we, if we have a tradition of gender-based spiritual practice, what is the divine will? So I don't think, as someone from my tradition believes, I don't think that we need to, to invent or to create. I think we need to uncover and discover that divine truth. So when these rabbis will continue to get this question, and now many of them have children and grandchildren. We were speaking earlier. If you have 10 kids, just statistically, we joke there's one in every million, right? It's a function of this kind of aspect of proximity. Simultaneously, you have young people, particularly in America, but I'm assuming it's the same here. They don't want to choose between a religious identity and a queer identity. And so what it used to be, if you wanted to come out, you needed to get out. And now people are staying put and saying, it's not on me to answer these questions. I am who I am. God doesn't make extra people. God doesn't put extra people in this world. God doesn't make mistakes. So you tell me where I'm supposed to sit if that's important to you. But I'm here and I'm not going anywhere, right? So that's something that I think is really shifting, and I think more and more there will be kind of a competency within the rabbinate of how do we address these questions, or at least hold sensitive space to have the conversation.
Right. It was interesting you talk about where does perhaps a genderqueer person sit in a shul. There was a news story not so long ago, I think it might have been out of the UK, I might be wrong, where an Orthodox shul had a transgender person attend, and it was a trans woman, but the shul decided to count her as part of the minyan because as a bar mitzvah, she was then a boy, as they saw it, which one might see these days. And it was I thought that was a rather offensive approach to being gender inclusive, because you have to respect the person's gender as they present it to you, and that person was they were taking both sides, letting her sit in the women's section, counting her as part of the minyan, which was, I thought, not quite right.
Yeah, that's correct. It's not quite right. It might be a lot not right. So I think there is this kind of meta question: where does gender lie? Yes. Right? God has gender attributes within Judaism, but God doesn't have a body. We're creating the image of the divine, and God doesn't actually have an image, and we have a tradition of gender-based spiritual practice. And so it speaks to the gender, at least in some way, existing on a spiritual level, below the surface. And below the surface, it's not complicated to occupy a lot of different spaces simultaneously. In fact, I think one of the things that's most complicated about our understanding of the divine is God's simplicity. The one thing we know about God is one, right? But God is also this and that and this and that. And so below the surface, I think we are all unique mixtures and blends of all sorts of different things. But in the physical finite space, we're sitting in the chairs that we're sitting in to the exclusion of all others. So when it comes to answering questions around gender identity, which of course is very different than sexual orientation, someone who who you want to sleep with is different than who you are when you go to sleep. Someone who's asexual is not free from gender identity. And so these are not parallel lines in that they do intersect, particularly in different waves of feminism, the way in which society kind of constructs what does it mean to be a man, what does it mean to be a woman, right? So these things have different kind of intersections and causes. But we don't need to necessarily, I think, at all answer that meta question of where gender lies to be able to kind of answer the questions of what's at stake at the intersection of gender-based spiritual practice and identity. So, for example, getting called up to the Torah in traditional places has historically been just for men. But in the Code of Jewish Law, it's recognized that it's actually a social construction, that it's not essentially a gender-based spiritual practice, that the Code of Jewish Law says, because of Kavod Tzibor, that at some point 500 years ago, perhaps it was a poor reflection on the male community, if they didn't know how to make these blessings, that they shouldn't kind of defer to women who were perhaps more literate. So, but that doesn't, but it's external to gender. So a woman of trans experience, a man of trans experience, someone who's assigned female and identifies and presents as male, we don't need to answer the question of, is there a place along a person's individualized transition, whether it's a name change, which not everybody goes through, or a wardrobe change, which not everybody does through, or haircuts, or hormones or surgery, because the substitute of social construction for gender, for simply a halachic construction of gender, is for most people not that helpful, right? Meaning if we say to somebody, listen, I understand that you are who you are, but if you could just do this other thing for us, then we'll validate you. Like it doesn't make the difference what the structure is. That's not helpful. So one way to kind of see it is that when there's what we would say in Hebrew like a gemiras das, when a person has clarity about their own identity, right? Because we're all struggling, experimenting, exploring, and then at some point we gain clarity of like, this I'm not unsure about. When a person has that level of clarity of understanding of self, so then we have a communal responsibility in supporting that. There are, I think, legitimate questions which are complicated to really think about what is within our tradition gendered and what isn't. For example, something that's shifting in America around language. We used to describe like female reproduction as opposed to now just reproduction, because not every woman has a uterus, and not everyone with a uterus is a woman. Female hygiene has shifted to just, feminine hygiene is just now hygiene. So, for example, within Judaism, circumcision was always kind of framed as a male rite of passage, a male covenantal. And the truth is that it actually has nothing to do with gender identity as much as it is body part specific, right? So it says in the Code of Jewish Law, a person who has some sort of accident was assigned male, male who want to convert to Judaism, circumcision is not necessary, because it's not about being circumcised, it's about not having a foreskin. So if a person, right, so there's a shift in the conversation around gender-based spiritual practice to things that might just be body part specific. So when it comes to being counted in Armenian, that's different than perhaps where to sit. But we have a communal responsibility to answer these questions at the intersection of manifested action without having to kind of have the hubris or confidence to be able to say, listen, I know everything about gender, because I think that's also just not a true statement. I don't know that we have access to all of that. But not having access to that doesn't mean that we can't be supportive in a practical way.
A few years ago, I'm not quite sure now how many years ago, there was a High Court case in Australia that involved a person who identified without a gender. Norrie, not sure if you've heard of that case. Norrie is legally gender neutral. The High Court determined that people in Australia could be gender neutral. And so you could have an X on your passport or your driver's license. You wouldn't be male, you wouldn't be female, you wouldn't have a gender, because through their life experience, they just didn't have gender as they were at that point in time and would continue to be. How do you feel in the context of a religion that is so gender-based, where would a person who is gender neutral or has a gender fluid experience or doesn't identify as male or as female, or necessarily either one exclusively, where does that person or those people fit into such a gendered, perhaps patriarchal religion?
Yeah, no, all of that is very real.
Because presumably the religion has to put people into boxes, or that part of the religion has to put people into boxes. And if there isn't a box, where do those people sit?
Yeah, I think there's a shared kind of convenience within Jewish law and law in general that likes lines, right? Everyone needs to, right? At this age, you can, right, get a license, for this thing, you have to pass this test, and if you don't have this score, so my experience has been that it's actually like very person specific, and I think the best advice I ever got in rabbi school was, to answer the person and not to answer the question. And so when a person presents and says, Rabbi, I was assigned male at birth, I identify as female, but I come from a particular place that I have this deep anxiety about not putting on tefillin, right? I can't be a person who doesn't wear tefillin. So is it okay as a woman to put on tefillin, right? That's different than the question of a person who says, as a woman, I want to put on tefillin and I'm trans, right? Like, so is it okay, you know, not because of my gender identity, but because of my gender identity in a different way, in a progressive way? So there, I think a few different ways of approaching it. Some of it is coming from a technical place of there are all these boxes. A person wants to get out of the question, and I want to kind of what can I do to check all the boxes so I don't have to answer the question? And for some people, that's actually much more therapeutic and calming and reduces the anxiety. And then for other people, putting on tefillin as a woman who's trans is a deeper erasure of her feminine identity, because only my tradition, only men put on tefillin. So I don't think there's one answer as much as there are, I think, kind of a shared set of questions that we can ask a person, framing it around their intimate and personal relationship with the divine. What do you feel God expects from you in this space? And giving access to information. When it comes to where to sit, I spoke at a synagogue in Toronto once, and they had 3 sections. They called it a tri-chitza. Now, if segregation of genders is like not intrinsically offensive, and I know that it is for many, and I have people who wouldn't daven in my shul because
CBST.
No. At my old synagogue, the old Broadway synagogue, there are people who felt like they wouldn't. I can't daven in a place where women are sitting different than men. And I had other people, particularly trans folks, who were like, "Oh my gosh!" Right, where the space itself is validating my gender identity. Right, like if it's to say it differently, and this is not. I'm not trying to speak to the qualities of egalitarianism, but let's say a complete posture of egalitarianism contributes on some level to the erasure of the trans experience, because if men and women are exactly the same, there's no place to transition. So part of the tension is, you know, to what extent is it supportive to recognize that there's something distinct about different genders, and at what point is, right? So like 70 cents on the dollar in America is not something that's essential about being a woman. It's just something that like seems to be very real. And so I think for certain people within their spiritual practice, there's a gendered component that, as somebody who's, let's say, genderqueer or gender neutral, that doing anything that codes as gender can either be supportive or the opposite in their relationship with the divine. And so somebody who's genderqueer, or let's say gender neutral, sitting in a place where they have to choose sides might not be the right place for them. And finding a place that has a 3rd section for either people who identify as both or neither, that might be an ideal. For others, they have some sort of fluidity. I was actually at the same conference in Toronto. There was somebody who had a necklace, and on the string had like these little tablets. One said him, and then the other one said her, the other one said they, and throughout the meal they were flipping it, right? Because in the moment, like, and this is an extreme example of fluidity, that in the moment they really felt a sensitivity to that kind of, they didn't change their wardrobe, they didn't change anything else, except that they wanted us to let us know what pronouns to use in the moment. And so it really is just person specific. Such a person who's feeling that, you know, in real time really can't sit on the other side of the mechitza because they couldn't go back and forth and back and forth. So it is person specific, but I think for people who present as a particular gender, that should be the dominant kind of variable of where they sit. It's less about identity and it's more about gender presentation. If a person doesn't feel strongly about it, they should sit in the way in which they pass, but if it does feel for them like it's a big deal, and again, it's so person specific. I had a student at Columbia who was trans, and was asking a bunch of questions, and I felt like I had clarity on a whole bunch of the questions, and some of the questions, like, I actually felt like I don't have anything intelligent to say, I just don't know. And so I said, listen, I'll work on it. And he said, Rabbi, I don't want to make you uncomfortable. This I can get out of, right? Being able to do all of this for now, it's the biggest win. It's beyond whatever I could imagine. And this, I'll make sure not to put myself or you in this situation. So I felt like I want you to know that I'm the one who's falling short here. It's not on you, but I don't have anything intelligent to say yet. So I think the genderqueer space is one of those spaces that we don't have a lot of intelligent things to say on. Like, the question's better than the answer. But the more that I think we can try to answer the individual and kind of reserve the best industry standards or best practices until we understand this a little bit better, we can kind of mitigate, you know, some of those issues.
Although at the moment at CBST this wouldn't be an issue for anybody, so you're in a very inclusive space. There wouldn't be an offensive there.
That's right.
People just sit and be and do what they need to
100%. And as a result, some Orthodox people, so we have a conference every other year, a convening for trans folks. Last year we had over 600 trans Jews. Because of COVID, people were more accessible through through Zoom and things. But there was an Orthodox contingent that said, we love being here, but we can't pray here. So as exclusive, as inclusive as it is,
so they wanted a different religion.
They wanted a different minion.
So it wasn't the space that was the problem. It was the religion.
So it's very hard to have something that and this is true around accessibility. That sometimes I was speaking in a state in America, a quick story, and there was a woman who was passing around the microphone when people were speaking Friday night, and she said, it's an issue of accessibility. Everybody should use a microphone. Some people had implants, and they had it wired through the system. And she came to me and I said, I so appreciate what you're doing and I support it, but when we think about accessibility, I won't speak into a microphone on Shabbos. So I can get up and I can speak really loud, but what's accessible for you is actually exclusionary for me. And so that's just part of the reality of being in relationships. We have different needs, and so when we think about being accommodating, part of the sensitivity is, what does it mean for the individual, as opposed to saying, this is how we're defining inclusivity, and if you can figure out how to get to the circle, then you're welcome. You
live in New York City.
Yeah.
It's a very progressive place. It's got a huge amount of diversity. And I've heard issues about, if I could just take something slightly political,
sure.
Not political, sort of political. Yeshiva University, there's a problem. The problem is that they have a queer society that they don't want to have as part of their organisation.
Yes.
How does that work for you? How do you see that playing out? What's the story? What's the background?
Sure. So, a little bit of background is that there's been a queer contingent there for a while. We've got some great pictures of some protests that we were at YU. The T-shirt said, "We too are YU," and it had the rainbow colors, right? Because the reality is that there are queer people there. And so, for those who don't know, the university was in opposition, and this group sued the university, and they won recently, just a few months ago. And so it's an appeal now in this process. But I think Orthodox spaces in general now really does fit into kind of a binary of either taking a stance that we want to purge this space already here, and it's actually not our space to exclude you, right? In other words, if we believe that the Torah is an inheritance, if we believe that Judaism is really just about Jews being in relationship with the divine, asking someone to deny who they are as a prerequisite for entrance is it's antithetical to everything that Judaism represents, which is a struggle for the truth. And so if we recognize that, of course, this space doesn't even belong to an institution, which is, I think, one of the reasons why in America in particular, institutional Judaism is really crumbling. You have empty buildings now, and you have people gathering in the streets because they recognize that Judaism has a pulse. We don't teach material, we teach people. In fact, the Gemara says in Shabbos, one of the reasons why the temple was destroyed is because we denied access to school children. Because if you think that bricks and stones are more holy than the people, then you're not worthy of having a building which is on a much lower level than the holiness of children. So I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a movement to really force it. And that's not the space that YU wants to be in. YU wants to be in a space, of course everybody's welcome here, of course this belongs to the Jewish people. But what Judaism says is as follows, and as a result, if you could just be somebody else, we could all be happy. And that's not a sustainable model, it's not a sustainable ask. And more people, young people, are feeling empowered to say, we're not leaving and we're not giving up on our identity, so it'd be great if you could just acknowledge the reality of us being here. So I do think over time it will get better. And one of the things that YU in general struggles with is the center in America is just, it's vanishing before our eyes. And I think historically, Yeshiva University has always held itself to be modern Orthodox, which is historically more to the left of, let's say, mainstream Orthodoxy or right-wing Orthodoxy. And within modern communities, I just did a wedding of two women a couple of months ago, where one came from a YU family and one came from a Ner Yisrael family. One of the women who got married, her brother got smicha from YU this summer. And so you have people within the Rabbinical Council of America, about half of, I would say a little bit more than half of kind of the largest body of Orthodox rabbis supports being inclusive and welcoming of LGBT folks. And so one option is that it just splits, that there's not going to be a centrist, there's not going to be a modern, there's going to be just the right and the left, which is what's happening in politics in America in general right now. But I think that Yeshiva University has enough of a blend that it's going to shift, and I think at some point the homophobic contingent is going to be the one that's marginalized and in the closet.
if you can accept that being more authentic as yourself is better for you and improves your mental health, and you perform better as a human, if you're at a university, you're going to study better, you're going to participate better, you're going to have better academic outcomes, and everything else. Wouldn't that be what the university would want? Presumably, maybe that become a centre of excellence rather a centre of exclusion.
Yeah.
And therefore, more people might come to them and see that they can get a better education. Then maybe that might be an angle.
It is an angle, and I think it's shifting. Yeah, meaning the power of hate is real. Like, we know that. We know how much the death and destruction through the ages. But the power of love, I think, is obviously much stronger. The head of the rabbinical school, the dean of the rabbinical school there, is Rabbi Penner. He's been relatively public in recent years of having a gay son. And he and his wife have now opened a support group, an LGBT support group. So he is not, he's in a very delicate position, as you can imagine. And some, I think, are really frustrated that he's only saying what he's saying. He's come out against conversion therapy in a way that was, I don't know, I read it as a little twisted, but in the end it was good. He said if conversion therapy worked, every person who was queer would have to go through it, because if you could choose not to be gay, then you would have to make that choice. And he sent his son to conversion therapy, and it was traumatic, deeply traumatic, I guess it is for everybody. But he said the reality is that it's not a choice, and it doesn't work. And so, we should stop the practice of sending people to conversion therapy, and we need to figure out how to create space within Orthodoxy for people to be gay and Orthodox, which is like a marked improvement, but it's a really twisted way of getting there. So I think that's where, to use different words, I think historically for 3,500 years it was seen as kind of, forgive me with the words, like an intolerable deviancy. And like it's now shifted to a tolerable deviancy that I'd rather, and this is mainstream Orthodoxy, I'm not okay with what you're doing, but I'd rather you be here than not. To go from there to acceptance and celebration doesn't take 3,500 years. It often doesn't take years. It takes sometimes a few weeks or months for people to process. So I think that's really the most important, and it's like it's not enough and it's not fast enough, but I think the most significant contribution has been from queer folks themselves saying, I'm here, I'm queer, right? And as a result, institutions have to make these choices. But yeah, I think common sense will prevail, that having healthy students who, and I think it's also something that's worth mentioning out loud, that when we talk about trans lives matter, I think your son has your husband has a pin that trans rights are human rights. It's all true, and the lives they live also matter, right? And so when we think about pikuach nefesh, the rabbinic kind of injunction of preserving human life and mental health, but there's also an aspect of the quality of life, right? We don't want people just to be on one side of killing themselves, right? We want people to be thriving, not just surviving. So I do believe that will be the conclusion, and I think it's when you have people who are in positions of authority and they're willing to take on the precarity. I think Judaism sees faith as a call to action. If we really believe in the divine, we can take on the precarity and leverage our privilege as a commodity and cash it in to say I'm going to do the right thing and deal with the consequences.
I want to ask you one more question, then open to the floor. So this is probably a big one. America seems to be generally tearing itself apart over one issue or another, whether it's gun rights or one extreme issue or another, reproductive rights. At the moment, we see Supreme Court sort of running the country in some ways. That's how people commentary on sort of undemocratic institution somehow, maybe. And that Roe versus Wade has been overturned, and that there's a possibility that at some point down the track, it may essentially be illegal to be gay, or it may be illegal to, like people might be excluded, etc., or whatever, and marriage equality might be overturned, and people might be able to get contraception, and this is sort of turning into a nightmare state.
Yeah.
It obviously has impact for people in this room and future generations and people who are married. Everybody in America, it's really quite a divisive and controversial situation. How do you see that panning out, and what are the possible outcomes? Yeah,
the good news is reproductive rights in America among Americans is not controversial at all. Like over 80%, right, support health, safe and free access to abortions, which is, I think, the reason to be optimistic. that we have a big problem around elections and voting in America, voter suppression. There's a lot that's wrong with America from the very beginning. There's a lot that's wrong that we thought we were past. But yeah, there've been initiatives to, in the South in particular, to make interracial marriage illegal again, and that's something that the vast majority of Americans are deeply offended by. So there's something that I think some of us think, like, okay, if you're not motivated now to vote, like, what are you going to wait for, right? Because if you're waiting longer, you're not going to be allowed to vote. If you're the type of person who would have voted against it. So the midterm elections are coming up in November. It's very scary. It's so messed up in America now that for those who are following, it's the dominant thought right now that Trump getting indicted will help him, right? That if Trump actually gets charged with espionage and other things, it'll give him more followers, right? There's something so distorted about where we're holding in America that the worse you are, and the bigger the lie, right, the more compelling it is as being true. But that's not the vast majority of Americans. What was the most scary, I think, about the last election is how close it was. It wasn't close at all, but if you have somebody who's clearly in the space that Trump is in, and other people, it shouldn't have been that close. So I think this goes one of two ways. This goes with love trumping hate or not. I am optimistic by nature. I have faith, but I do believe that faith is a call to action, and so I hope that. They say in Yiddish, achem vei, like if sometimes it's difficult to be in these situations, but achem vei should ever get harder to do the right thing. So I hope that this motivates people. In terms of the Supreme Court, there are a lot of different thoughts. At some point, some people will retire. There's some people there, depending, Clarence Thomas, for example, his wife was very involved in January 6th, and there are some people who are looking into having him removed. I'm not particularly optimistic. There are other thoughts of adding more justice and what they call packing the court. Right now, in theory, we have a majority in all of the different branches, but practically speaking, like the Biden administration really hasn't been able to do anything. He's had a few wins in recent weeks, climate change and some things around inflation, gun control in America. It's to say I'm embarrassed is like an understatement. It's the most. It's just insane. There are mass shootings every single day. And people are, there's nothing good to say about it. But it's not motivating people enough. It's just not motivating people enough to get out and to vote people in that are willing to have sensible legislation. So I am optimistic that this piece around the Supreme Court has triggered people that otherwise wouldn't vote in a midterm election, and there's a chance that we'll be able to keep a majority, but I think that requires a lot of faith. For example, Liz Cheney, who is on the commission looking into January 6th, her father is Dick Cheney, and she's articulate, and she's bright, and she's sane, and she's a bit of a tzaddikus. Like, she's a very normal person who's saying, I'm not okay with what's happening within my own party, and right now it looks like she's going to lose by a lot. And so voting for or supporting Trump in many places is the ticket for success. And so when you're like aligning your values with that, and that provides some sort of comfort that it'll be successful, it says much more about the country than it does about anything else, and it's not good. I don't know. I wish I had better news. Like, I'm optimistic because but practically people care about themselves, and so if they're okay. Which the majority of people in America are straight, the majority of people in America are cis, the majority still in America are white. Just until it becomes very personal, they don't care enough.
Thank you for those thoughts. So I'd like to open to the floor if people have questions for Jack.
Firstly, thank you, amazing Michael, for what you've done over the years, with obviously the support of others, and thank you, Rabbi, for the amazing leadership you're showing, especially in such a difficult space. Controversial. But the main question I have, the first one is about do you have any other key allies within the Orthodox rabbinate organizations, or you considered a pariah?
Certainly, Yeah, yes, and I'm not alone in this. Probably alone as the only kind of very out in public figure in the Ultra-Orthodox world. But we have a lot of public, private support. I get a lot of referrals from people. People in Lakewood, people in the yeshivish, and even the Hasidic world saying, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, but I can't have this conversation with him, but could you? So I get a lot of people in very cryptic ways like, can I send you somebody? And I'll ask for some sort of context. And they'll say, as if it was like a question, right? I know
the feeling.
Right? But recently a Shiva called me. He says, listen, again, you'll forgive all the parts of this which are offensive, but it's part of the course. He said, listen, I have a boy. He came out to me, he's gay, he's 22. His parents are really pushing him to marry a woman. And he said to me, this kid is so gay, no amount of conversion therapy is going to help. He is really happy sitting and learning right now, which may or may not be true from the boy's perspective, but from the rabbi's perspective. So what can I tell the parents to convince them not to send him to conversion therapy? Because it's not going to work and then he's not going to be observant anymore. So that's an edge where I think sane people, rational, intelligent people will say, it's super clear that this is only going to hurt the person. More and more Orthodox rabbis, particularly in the Ultra-Orthodox world, but certainly in are shifting that they won't officiate a wedding if they know the boy's gay. And that is becoming more of kind of the premarital counseling, you're attracted to her, right? So one of the things that's also shifted is around Pride in particular in America, certain yeshivas used to always have counter-protests and with horrific offensive signs. And then they realized that exposing their students to the fact that there's such a thing as a pride parade and they're queer people, allowed a lot of people to say oh, that's who I am. And then there's people being exposed and saying, hey, I thought I was alone and now I realize that there's a whole community. So they stopped the protests. And so one of the things that's happening even in the most insular communities is that those walls are simply not as hermetically sealed as they used to be with technology, with access to the internet. When I first started, people would call and say, they didn't have the words, transgender. They would say, I feel like I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, right? They would just describe it, it doesn't feel authentically. And now people are able to kind of tap into to the language piece, which is never as expansive as the experiences themselves that come to describe. But there's actually a WhatsApp group. It's international. We keep the ratio of rabbis to queer folks in Orthodoxy 1-to-1, and now there's over 200 of us on a kind of an underground Orthodox coalition. They're not out, but it allows people, if they're traveling, to know which synagogues are, can they be assured they won't hear anything that's homophobic, that they'll be, supported, etc. And so it is growing, and I think there's the inside fight and the outside fight.
You need to take a pragmatic approach, basically.
Yeah, I think they're both important fronts. Theologically, I think, Moses worked in Egypt kind of subversively as somebody with a lot of power. He would tell the taskmasters, you're giving this heavy load to somebody who's weak, this weak load to somebody who's very strong. If you want these things built, you need to switch it. And that was very much working within the system. And then he came to this moment where he saw the taskmaster going to kill somebody. He felt like he couldn't be silent, he couldn't be passive. He, really in 3 verses, he goes from running Pharaoh's house to being on the run. And it's not coincidental, the story then continues where God meets him at the burning bush. And God says to him, because you were willing to look away from your privilege to what was going on in this other space, I, God, will also look away from the privileged space of heaven to pay attention to what's going on over here. It's very interesting Medrash. But it was really that act of what was considered the cashing in of the privilege that allowed him to really have the access to the ultimate kind of resource of the divine to lead. So I think we never lose by doing the right thing, and if we do the right things, we're going to end up in the right space. But I think on a practical level, it's really important to have people at the table who are already there, that if they would say something, systemic change happens incrementally. And we had a case with the Orthodox yeshiva in America where there was a boy who was gay, and they had asked him to wait till he graduated to get married to his boyfriend. And in a kind of a public way, he got engaged on stage at a concert, and he moved in with his boyfriend, and then she felt like they had to throw him out. In part because had he moved in with his girlfriend, they also would have thrown him out, right? It was less about the queer piece, but the optics weren't great. And Rabbi Chaimim and I came to that yeshiva the next day after speaking to the boy, and he was not happy about it. He thought that we would, chain ourselves to the door and have a protest. But they said, listen, we want to get this right. We're just not there yet. What can we do to move it? And particularly young people, right? It takes a certain amount of maturity to say, like, I understand where you are, I understand your intentionality, and there's some impact issues, but like we want to help you get there. So I think within Orthodoxy, there's the vast majority of it, I think, has moved away from the posture of like outward homophobia, because it's not helpful, and has slowly gotten to this space of somewhere between tolerance and acceptance. And one of the big edges is, the people are asking, like, can I go to my nephew's wedding to another man? And it's an evolving conversation, but more and more people are feeling like what's achieved in that kind of protest of boycotting. I told a parent, I was doing another wedding of two women, and one of the grandparents wanted to walk out and protest by the chuppah. They were willing to come to the wedding. And I said, I appreciate the fact that you want to make a protest, but like there are different ways of protesting. And if you can protest like in a subversive way, right, the way in which the Ultra-Orthodox in Israel, with their own issues, are part of the government, right, and have huge voting blocks, even though they don't actually identify as Zionists, right? So there's a way in which you can be impactful and influential. So get a front row seat at the wedding, right, and make sure you're smiling more than anybody else by the chuppah. And they want to have a family, so like start a yeshiva fund for your great grandkids, right? Like be deeply engaged, because what you want to achieve in terms of that continuity of having observant descendants, right? That can be achieved here if you're willing to kind of be part of it.
Can I put it though that I have this fundamental issue where rabbis seem to take a disproportionate obsession with the sex lives of queer people. Yeah. Disproportionate. No one gives a flying fuck if a heterosexual couple do whatever in their bedroom, but everyone seems to think that two men having a relationship, everything could possibly happen that is completely inappropriate. And the rabbis seem to obsess exactly about the act. Yeah. The act. Yeah. Like Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, no, the sexual act. Yeah. What is it, this absolute obsession these rabbis have with the private sex lives of people's private lives? Isn't private, and when it's private, it's none of your business?
I completely agree with you. We don't ask, straight couples if, the wife went to the mikvah, like we're not engaged in that conversation.
Or if she straps it on,
We're not, we're the things that we don't discuss. Yeah. So I think that it actually has its source in homophobia. You hear conversations about, queer folks and love is love, almost always devolving in those spaces to like incest and bestiality. Like what happens if somebody loved their cow, or like it becomes bizarre, right? Really quickly.
Guess you might be very rewarding.
So I think part of what that comes from is that like, and historically there's an ultra-Orthodox newspaper in America called the Yated, and I was in it once where they had accused me of advocating for cross-dressing in illicit relationships, which if you know anything about those things, they don't go together, right? There's illicit relationships, there's cross-dressing, but it's not. But when you don't know what you're talking about, right, so then it all gets lumped together. And I think if you see the queer experience as being a perversion, so then bestiality, incest, it's all the same, and you assume that the motivation is not about dignity and partnership and love and companionship in a relationship of two consenting adults who are sophisticated, but it's this perversion of desire. And so of course the only thing that's there is these massive orgies, right? Like that is what it is. Right?
I wish, but it doesn't happen.
Right. So I think that part of what like straight folks need to hear is that like, if you're worried that like two guys, because they're gay, like all things are just going to happen instantaneously, like is that your experience with women, right? Like right? It's not the way that humans work, right?
We have very ordinary lives, generally speaking, and we really know very different.
For sure, and I think that's one of the things that, and also like when you think about the places historically where marginalized segments of society are able to find community, they're rarely in the center, and so you haven't historically seen out queer folks in mainstream society, because mainstream society was intolerant of it. So it's only now that we're actually being able to have role models like the folks in this room, where young people and I think society can say, oh my gosh, to say it differently, in the last 50 years, there's been tremendous progress around the LGBT issues, and racial equality has not happened at the same speed. And one of the ways that people reconcile is that you can get to know somebody and find that they happen to be queer. After you get to know them, they're like an amazing human, where the color of a person's skin presents right away, and with that, people's prejudices. And I think also it's been helpful for a lot of people around the trans experience. It seems there are a lot of different and interesting observations. I don't know what it is in Australia, but in America, the first kind of modern movement was 3-to-1 male to female, and now it's 3-to-1 in the opposite direction. The majority of trans folks, young trans folks in America, are men. And there's also an observation that often people are aware of their gender identity earlier than their queer identity. So you have people who are 4, 5, 6 saying, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy, I'm not a boy, I'm a girl.
Visibility, sorry if I can interrupt.
Yeah, sure.
It's about like trans women were just more visible.
Yes.
And now you're saying that it's changing, but I don't believe it's changing because there's higher numbers of trans men. I think it's just about visibility.
It's very possible. I think there are a lot of factors. That could be very one of it.
The major component is just that you're seeing more trans men. They just weren't face.
It could very well be.
Trans women were just more visual, more speaking more, coming out more. I don't know. Just having a different also birth background, maybe had more courage, more lip.
Yeah.
A whole bunch of factors going into it. So I think the case is more just we weren't seeing enough trans boys, trans men speaking, coming out, being showing awareness, and so
100%.
I think that's really more the case of just now we're seeing them. And
it could very well be.
And we know about them. And
I think all of that is true.
And TERFs also talk
and
about
also
trans
just to speak about that for a second.
It's all of that going on.
It's a lot of complicated.
We see literature like Yentel.
Yeah.
Looked at something
That's right.
else totally before.
Yeah.
Yentel is that
well, now there's different paradigms.
Barbara Streisand.
Barbara Streisand, the Machete thing, the story of someone that was born as female and then presented as a male to study, and it was supposed to be just for the studying. Now it's seen differently.
There are a lot of contributing factors, and one of the things that we do have in America in particular, and I don't know how it is here, but older lesbians, and these words have been reclaimed, so they're not pejoratives, but like dyke, butch, masculine, older lesbians, it could be that had they been born and raised in today's culture, it could be some of them would have transitioned, right? In other words, if you think that being a man is the worst thing in the world, right? So then it's just that we see that the cultural contributions of gender construction are very generational, when the essential aspects of gender can sometimes present very, very differently. So I think, and also the role of technology and medicine in particular, and the ability to pass, and the ability, I think they all contribute. You're 100% right that there have always been people, and sometimes there's just more visibility now. But one of the things that's a struggle, or to say it in a more positive way, one of the things that I think has been helpful for people in leadership positions and rabbis and parents is that when they can see a kid who's 4, 5, 6, 7, having zero awareness of sexual orientation or desire, and just kind of declaring very factually, like, I am a boy, I am a girl, right? There's something that takes it out of that place of perceived perversion of, like, this is for a desire, this is about something interpersonal, and this is really just about who I am, independent. And there's a certain kind of, like, purity of children in particular that when they speak about their gender identity, I think it's helped people process that, oh, this is something that's not about anything licentious or nefarious. This is actually just a recognition of one's truth. So I think all of these things are helpful, and there's a lot of work to go.
With regard to the recognition of one's truth, you mentioned that divine has no form.
Right? No physical form, meaning we don't believe that God has a body.
So, but there is a spirituality.
Absolutely, that's gendered. Yes.
There's a neshama.
Absolutely.
So how does that? How does the spirit of a 6-year-old boy say I'm a girl? What's your interpretation?
I think it's a sensitivity issue. For people who convert to Judaism and they say I feel Jewish, well, like, what is that? As somebody who was born Jewish, if I had to say, like, what does it mean that I feel Jewish? Like, I don't know that I have good words for that. And I think the parallel around conversion is helpful for many, in that Judaism believes that the soul of a convert was at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And in fact, the Zohar says we don't talk about the non-Jew who converted. We use the language of Gershon as Geyer, the convert who converted. Right? They were assigned to convert at birth, and there's just some paperwork and things along the way. So when I think about an awareness of gender, I don't feel masculine. I know that I present masculine, and I've never been misgendered. People assume I'm trans all the time. People assume that I'm gay all the time. A woman sent me an email last week from the Forward. She said, as an out Orthodox gay rabbi, would you mind doing an interview? So I said, maybe you know something I don't know. But, right, and it's one of the reasons when I speak, I try to talk about myself as an ally, because people do assume that I'm trans, because why else would I be in this place? And there's awkwardness, and I'm shifting the title towards allyship. But
it could be the worst possible thing you are.
Yeah, so what I think is that there are people that have a sensitivity on a soul level, particularly children, where they have a sense of truth, free from like the artificial pressures of society. I think that there's simply an awareness of that internal soul level. Yeah.
I'd like to thank Rabbi Mike Moskowitz from New York. Please stay. We're not going to shut the doors immediately, are we? No. The doors are fine to stay open for as long as we need them. There's some snacks, drinks, hot drinks over here. There's regular milk, soy milk, and light milk in that order on the table there. And there's biscuits.